and welcome to the Sustainable Living Podcast. We have a very special guest today, Ethan Waldman. He is a tiny house pioneer. I'm so excited to have him on today. I had the pleasure of being on his amazing podcast. He's going to tell you more about it. Welcome, Ethan.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's great to be here.
So let's get started. And I know everyone would like to know, how did you get involved in this tiny house movement? What did that beginning look like for you?
Well, back in 2011, I was pretty bored working a corporate job, kind of in the career that I had picked out for myself. And I decided to take a sabbatical from work, and I did a 1-month bicycle tour with my cousin on the West Coast. And we cycled over 1,500 miles and used couch surfing and campsites pretty much the whole way. And I ended up staying in 3 different tiny houses on that trip. People kept telling me, "Oh my God, this trip is going to be so life-changing for you. It's going to be so amazing." And I'm just like, on this trip, I'm so sore. I'm so tired of biking. And I'm like, when is my life going to change? I don't feel like anything has changed. But it wasn't until I got home, like back to my quote unquote real life, that I realized that I had changed. And suddenly my apartment, full of books and music and furniture and all this stuff that I had already acquired at the age of 26 felt like a giant weight that was kind of dragging me down. And I had already heard of tiny houses, but I dove in with some more research. And at the time, there really wasn't much out there. So I found Cami Strobel's blog, rowdykittens.com, and her husband, Logan, actually had a tiny house that was designed by D. Williams and built by Pad in Portland. And when I saw that, it just clicked, and I knew that was just the perfect solution for me.
Oh, what a wonderful story. It's interesting how that I hear that pattern a lot in the tiny house world. So that's really amazing that it worked out for you. And now from those beginnings, it has evolved into a book, a website, a podcast. So let's actually start with the book, because I agree with you. The resources were definitely, at least in 2015, for me, the resources were very minimal. The only one I could find was the Andrew Morrison site with the home model. So let's dive into this book you created and what it offers to these tiny home dwellers.
Sure. So I guess to pick up the story, I built the house over the course of 14 months and finished it in the fall of 2013. And during the building process, I registered thetinyhouse.net, and I was like, oh, I'm going to blog throughout my build and document everything and be a good resource. And that went out the window so fast, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
It's exhausting, and I barely had the energy to cook dinner after a day of building, let alone like upload my photos and like write a blog post. So I just registered a Facebook page, which is Building the Tiny House. It's still the same page. And I started posting photos of the build throughout the days. And by the time I was done building the house, the page had over 5,000 likes, and I hadn't done any promotion or any like intentional promotion. And as I finished the house and as I was living in it, I started getting emails and messages from people constantly, just, why did you choose this heater over that heater? What kind of insulation did you use? What stove is that? Are you happy with what you decided for your flooring? And I realized that there were a lot of questions out there and not a lot of answers. And so I started working on the book that eventually became Tiny House Decisions, which I self-published in September of 2014.
Oh man, you were really ahead of this. That's great.
Yeah, and it's just, I've written a couple more things since then. I put out Tiny House Parking, but really Tiny House Decisions is still the main thing that I offer. I'm actually working on a huge, like, second edition of it right now that I'm hopefully going to have out in time for Christmas. But basically, what it is 3 sections. So the first section is the big decision. So it helps you decide, how tiny is too tiny? Should you build it with help or yourself or some combination? Should you do it on wheels or off wheels? It really dives into each one of those questions in detail and kind of gives you the pros and cons of each option. And then part 2 is all the systems. So we go through heat, electric, toilets, plumbing, forgetting, there's probably more, but it goes through each one of those systems. Again, pros, cons of all the different options. I also include what would be what my choice was and whether I'm happy with it or not. And then the last section is the construction decisions. So screws versus nails, SIPs versus framing, all those constructions decisions. And what's cool about the book is that it's not at all a construction manual. It's not going to teach you how to frame a house because that's, I was a novice builder when I came to my tiny house, and I finished as a functional novice, but, I'm not out there teaching people how to build because that's not my strength, but my strength is absolutely research and teaching people about the systems in these houses. So that's what the book seeks to do.
I think that that's huge for especially DIYers and even for the person going with a builder because a lot of these builders are offering custom designs. So if you come into it already knowing, you can sort of weed out those builders that are going to help you with your vision and those that aren't. But I really appreciate the work and the time you put in because I know, I wish I would have known about your book and I didn't realize that it was already out. And
I wish you had known about it.
oh my gosh, I wish because, and anyone who's listening and you are thinking of a tiny house, definitely grab his book because Tiny House Decisions, because I can't even tell you the countless hours you would have saved me probably 2 months of research because like you said you come at it from this is what worked for me or this didn't work for me, so that can really help guide people and save them a lot of time. So is so exciting. I'm so excited for the second book. Now I'm curious also from this perspective, do you touch on any of the codes or is that something that you kind of just are letting evolve, or how does that get incorporated?
Yeah, I wanted the book to be lasting, and if I were to dive into codes, it would need to get updated every 2 weeks.
Oh, right.
So basically, I talk about the history of tiny houses on wheels in the United States and about how Jay Schaefer initially put the house on wheels to get around his local codes because they wouldn't let him build a house under a certain number of square feet. And he said, well, I'm putting it on a trailer, so it's not a house. And I talk about how there are 3 different options for how to deal with your local building authorities. You can ask for permission up front, you can ask for permission later, or you can go under the radar. And I talk about the pros and cons of each one of those options. And, I just recommend that if you want to be 100% legal, that you will need to do your own research and reach out to your local building authorities.
I really appreciate you saying that because just being on that kind of strand of the tiny house movement right now. We'd had some people offer some help from California, and I was like, I really appreciate that, but it's so individualized. It depends. It's literally up to like 3 or 4 people in the zoning department. It's so personal. It so depends on your location and moving from Minnesota to Colorado. Water rights aren't even spoken of in Minnesota and weren't even like on the radar, and then coming out here and water rights is like everything out here. So it's so individualized that you do have to do your own research, although it looks like you have an amazing guide on your website with tiny house parking with some great general knowledge, because you still do need that general knowledge of how to approach. Are there any specific tidbits or maybe like your favorite kind of approach for that as far as tiny house parking?
Well, and tiny house parking kind of takes a similar approach as tiny house decisions, just because, again, it's so hard to create a guide that tells you how to park your tiny house legally in any specific place, or even the process to go through to getting it okayed in your town. So in tiny house parking, I focus a lot on how to find a great place to build your tiny house, like what to look for in a great building spot, and also what to look for in a good parking spot and things to consider when you're looking for parking. So things like water, power, flat, level ground, solid ground. And I do list a lot of resources. I also talk about the process that I went through for finding parking and kind of give a whole bunch of different options because I get emails from people all the time like, how do I find a parking spot? And it's like, reach out to your network of friends, post on Facebook, post on Craigslist. Like, who do you know who owns land? Who do you know who owns a house who wants to earn some extra income? So it's those kinds of things in tiny house parking as well.
It's so interesting, how all these things sort of parallel. So I definitely need to get your website linked up with mine because I get that question all the time and now I know where to send them. So thank you for all this work and research. Now let's move over to the podcast. So now you have a podcast as well, and I had the pleasure of being on it, and I just so appreciate all the people who you interview. So as far as your podcast go, what was your vision for that? How has it evolved as far as getting it going? Because I know it's rather new, correct?
Yeah. I just published the 19th episode this morning.
Yay!
Well, on the day that we're recording, I recognize that this won't go out until who knows when. But yeah, so the idea for the podcast actually came because I run a private online tiny house community called Tiny House Engage. And it's got about 100 members. And I was getting these awesome guests to come in to my Tiny House Engage community and do Q&As. And I realized that I had this reach. I had the ability to reach out to amazing people like Alexis and Christian from Tiny House Tiny House Expedition, or Jenna from Tiny House Expedition. Johnny, oh man, I'm getting them backwards. So I had the ability and the relationships to reach out to these people, but by doing it in this private group, I was kind of limiting the reach of these interviews. So I started thinking about, what I wanted to create, and I was tempted by the YouTube channel route because people seem to be having great success on YouTube. But the reality is I'm not traveling around all the time, and I'm not like going to be able to fill a YouTube channel with countless amazing tiny houses to tour. And I love listening to podcasts. I'm a huge consumer of podcasts. So I decided, hey, I should create something that I would like to listen to. And so the Tiny House Lifestyle podcast was born. And the idea is to bring on a whole range of guests. And it is mainly an interview show, though I do plan to do solo episodes in the future. But DIYers who have done something interesting or unique, professionals. I'm not opposed to having some people on from industry if they're doing innovative things, advocates, and even kind of people who are, I don't want to use the word tangential, but I can't come up with a better word. People who are doing things that I think are applicable to the tiny house movement, but haven't necessarily been connected yet.
Oh, I love that. It's like a networking resource.
Exactly. And just I try to keep the shows, 30 minutes or less around that time. So they're quick, they're informative, hopefully, they're inspiring, usually, and I've just been having a lot of fun doing them.
So let's hop into your personal experience in your tiny house. Being the Sustainable Living podcast, what are some things that kind of inspired you as far as like the sustainability of a tiny house, and how do you kind of create that because I know that's a big thing for a lot of tiny house dwellers. Is part of the reason a lot of tiny house dwellers jump in is for the sustainability aspect. So what have you noticed about the sustainability of your tiny home?
The reason that I initially jumped into tiny house living, what attracted me first was the finances, but it quickly became so much more about that. And one of the things that my wife Anne and I just kind of fell in love with is the compost and composting, and that was totally brought on by the tiny house. So we use the very basic Humanor sawdust toilet. So there's a great book called the Humanor Handbook that people can read if they're interested in learning more about that. But basically, that is the toilet that we use at the tiny house. But it turns out that to make great compost with human waste, you also have to add a lot of food scraps because the human waste is super nitrogen rich and you need to add some carbon. So we realized that we needed to start adding everything, like all of our kitchen scraps. And at this point, we are not living tiny full time, we're there part time. And so we actually bring all of our food and kitchen scraps from our condo in the city out to the tiny house, and everything gets composted there, and it's just reduced the amount of waste that we are putting into the landfill tremendously.
Oh yeah, and that's an interesting perspective because you there's kind of this like a stigma, right? Like in the at least in the within the tiny house realm and maybe outside too, like, oh, you have a tiny house, you have to live in it 100%, you have to be off grid, you have to be under 400 square feet. And I really appreciate, that's why I love your podcast so much, because you do sort of include everyone, and it's still this, it's not even necessarily, it is the tiny house movement, but it's also just like simplify and freedom, and there's so much more to it. So I appreciate, you find ways to make things, more sustainable in your current situation. And we've been in backyards. So yeah, we've done stuff like that too. Like we had one property where there were chickens and alpacas. So that's where all our compost went. And you just kind of make it work, and it evolves wherever you stay. And I think there's so many avenues. So I really appreciate that perspective and you guys making that work.
Yeah, and it just shows you once you start doing it's really not that hard. And I think we were talking in the pre-show, like when we take out the garbage, like the landfill trash, and we actually have our trash can labeled landfill, like it takes weeks and weeks for it to fill up because it's really just like the wrapper from this or that, anything that can't be recycled, which is not that much, and there's no food waste in there. Sometimes I take the trash out because it smells, not because it's full.
No, that's so true. And I think many of us don't realize that most of our trash is food. So that's a really good point. And when you have a tiny house, a lot of tiny houses can't fit a big garbage can. So just the fact that they're small kind of makes you rethink your usage of garbage and water. And have you noticed any difference in your water usage?
Well, so the tiny house, we're fortunate to be hooked up to a spring, which flows all the time. And in Vermont, Vermont is one of those places that is very unlike the rest of the country and the world. There is an abundance of water here. So so we have a spring on the property that literally, like, they excavate out a hole in the ground and they put a big concrete tile in it, and it just fills up with water, and water just keeps coming out of it. It's crazy. So we don't really have to conserve a lot of water at the tiny house, but there are other things about it that we conserve. So we only have 7 gallons of hot water at a time. So we have a super low flow shower head, and obviously that's a fairly short shower. Also, because the house is tiny, you don't want to use a ton of dishes and make a huge mess. So like we reduce the number of dishes that we use and the amount that needs to be washed, and that's a way that we reduce water. Yeah, we're super lucky in that regard that water isn't a big issue here.
Oh yeah, I can attest to that because moving from Minnesota, I was like, we, like you said, we just use less water, but even moving to Colorado now, I'm even more aware of my water usage than I ever was before. So yeah, we do use some of those tricks as well. Well, awesome. I'm so appreciate any last words of wisdom for people, people who are looking at your information and just sort of diving into this tiny house movement. What recommendations do you have? Any big ideas that really helps you on your journey?
Surround yourself by people who are already doing it. In whatever way you can. Find a meetup group, go to a tiny house festival, listen to the Tiny House Lifestyle podcast. Just kind of get it into your head that it's doable, because there are so many people doing it and loving it. And you may encounter friends or family who are going to try to talk you out of tiny house living, And you should listen to them. You should hear what they have to say because it's not right for everyone. I don't recommend tiny house living for every single person, but surround yourself by people who are doing it so that you can really get a sense for whether it's the right thing for you.
Oh, that is definitely the best information I would give as well. And I kudos because yeah, you definitely want to do your research and jump in knowing what you're doing. And a little quick shout out to We Casa here in Colorado, offering a hotel experience so you can test out tiny homes. So We Casa is really fun. I'm sure there's other ones across the country. So yeah, definitely stay in one, do your research for sure. So you have a ton of amazing resources out there. Let's get people connected. How can they find you, access your book, your podcast?
Everything that I create is at thetinyhouse.net. So go to thetinyhouse.net. You'll see Tiny House Decisions in the main menu. You'll see Podcast in the main menu. You'll see Tiny House Parking in the main menu. It's all there.
Oh, wonderful. And is it the same tag on Instagram as well and Facebook?
So this is where my branding strategy is poor. So I'm at Ethan Waldman on Instagram, so just my name. And on Facebook, I'm at Building the Tiny House.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I want to make sure people can access you because I know social media is a big thing right now. And apparently, I don't know if you knew this, Ethan, but I am 33. Apparently, Facebook is only for parents. So I want to be sure people had your Instagram tag as well. So thank you for that.
I'm getting better at Instagram stories. I'm starting to learn from the youth. I'm also 33, so we're the same old age.
Oh, I know, right? Hey, 33 is the new 25, right?
Yeah.
No. Ethan, thank you so much for all your wisdom and all you're doing for this movement. I so appreciate it. You guys definitely check out his website. I've been peeking at it and getting some great information, and I'm going to link it to my website so that when people are looking for tiny house information, they know where to go. So thank you, Ethan, and you keep on doing what you're doing and helping this movement move forward.
You too, Emily. Thank you so much.